have you ever had a guest that kind of after the interview, it really put into their perspective their music?
Oh yeah, it happens all the time, especially with people that I know actually.
Oh,
Because
interesting.
when we talk, especially
Yeah, yeah.
like I had a lot of people on from Columbia, and I've been at Columbia for 6+ years now, and I still teach at Columbia even though I graduated. And a lot of my colleagues there, I kind of know them kind of in passing mostly, or when we talk, it's not really about music; it's about other things.
Yeah.
But when I'm having them on the show, it's like my first time I've actually sat with them for an hour and talked about their music. And then also like listening to a bunch of their music
Yeah,
before I had them on. It's like for you, I listened to like an hour of your music before I had you on. And I rarely do that. It's can you imagine? I mean, besides going to a concert, like, do you ever just sit there and listen for make a concerted effort? I'm going to listen to this person's music. I mean, it doesn't happen that often, I feel like. And it didn't happen with me until I started doing the show. I said, okay, let me actually listen to a bunch of pieces by this person and let me get a feel for this person. I'm not going to think about any questions. Like, for example, I have this card here. There's no questions. The only thing on this card are the names of your pieces and the excerpts that I used from them. So wherever the conversation goes, it goes. If we talk about all three pieces, we talk about all three pieces. If we talk about one or two, we talk about one or two. So that's kind of my approach to this whole thing. With people like you that I've never met in person, it's almost like, for me, I think the audience hasn't met you in person or anybody that I had sitting in that chair. So now I'm like an audience member with you.
Totally.
I actually want to play one of your pieces first. This is for amplified sinfonietta and sampler. It's called Hasta, pueda. I would really like one day actually to have like a little speaker thing here, or where we can actually listen together, and like maybe we can film a reaction or comment or something.
That would be cool,
But I just don't have I don't have the mechanism to do that yet. Yeah. When I was listening to this piece, I actually didn't really read any of the program notes first, but I thought to myself, this sounds like alarm will sound. And then I went back after I finished and said, oh, it is alarm will sound.
It definitely has that alarm will sound kind of vibe to it, aesthetic.
Yeah, but like with this piece, and then after I read the program, I said, okay, that makes a lot of sense. All the extra musical things going on. I'd really love to know like how this all started and how you translated some of these extra musical ideas to music.
Yeah, this piece was very hard to make because, as you mentioned, it's a very personal piece. And I started writing it in last summer, well, not the summer, the past year summer. And around that time, my mom was born with hearing loss. And that's something that's been present throughout all of our lives. Even when I was a kid, that was one of my biggest fears. The idea that, she kept losing hearing inconsistently every year. And so even when I was 10 or so, I remember having that moment of, there's probably going to be a moment where she's not going to be able to hear me, or we're not going to be able to share a lot of like things together because of the hearing loss, even though, hearing aids are getting way better. At the time, she didn't even have hearing aids, so that was even more present. But that's always been a little bit in the back of my mind, that fear. But that year, that summer, she actually did one of the routine tests, that they do to see how things are. And she had actually lost, I think it was like 50% in 1 year at that point. And that was a little bit of a, oh God, wake up call in that sense of, this is happening. And, it's not necessarily inherently a bad thing, but it's a reality you have to deal with and you have to accept and kind of make the most out of it. So I was in that mindset a little bit when I started writing the first sketches. And it took a lot of back and forth because it felt really weird to talk about stuff like that in a piece. Usually a lot of my music, it's very personal, very vulnerable. And that's one of the things that I like the most when it comes to approaching a piece. But in this case, it was not necessarily about me. It's affecting me as her son, but it's not about me. And that was a very hard decision to make. And I remember going back and forth a lot about, how, or for example, am I going to write the piece about this, but not tell anyone, Those are all decisions. And I knew that I wanted to do something with it because it was so present in my mind. And more than anything, it came from this idea of, I want to understand how she listens to the world. And I remember just Googling, to see if there was any website or anything, any software. And I remember finding this website where you can actually upload audio files and you can actually input the type of hearing loss that the person has, how long they've had it for, etc. A lot of parameters, and it gives you an approximation of what this person listens, how they listen to the world. And so I uploaded a bunch of her favorite music. And I remember just having that moment of listening to this very muted, warped version of her favorite songs, and that was so impactful for me. So that was one of the first steps that my music deals a lot with other people's music. I don't know why. I'm just really upset with that idea of the interconnectedness between different kinds of music and how they speak to each other. So that's usually something that I do. But with this piece, I wanted to do the same idea, but coming from a point of view of, if this piece is about her and this idea again of where is the limits of me versus this is her story, I don't want to just pick songs that I like, songs that we both liked. I wanted to pick songs that she really liked and that have a strong memory when I was a kid of that she would listen to it and she would really enjoy it, even if I'm not the biggest fan of the song, or I was like, oh, how do I deal with this song and for this piece? That's how I first started. I always started with a playlist, and it's just my mood board to kind of hear sounds and start envisioning things. And I just did it a 3-hour playlist of songs I remember that she really liked. And at that point I was already pretty sure that I was going to do the piece about it, but it still had so many challenges in terms of how to put all of this together, because most of them were power ballads and my music usually is pretty fast. It's groovy. It's oh God, how am I going to deal with this? So yeah, that was the first challenge and the first step into deciding about how to approach this piece.
I mean, I think it's even more vulnerable than talking about yourself in a way, because you're bringing somebody else's kind of, not issues, but, they're the private things that maybe they don't want anyone else to know about at all. I thought it was very moving. And actually, I probably didn't need to know the backstory either to enjoy the piece, but knowing the backstory makes me appreciate the piece actually more, to be honest, especially with the way, I only played a couple minutes of it, but especially the way the form moves throughout the piece and how you kind of get this kind of kaleidoscopic effect of things kind of becoming more in focus and then they kind of get out of focus. You really hear that if you hear the entire, I think it's an 8-9 minute piece. Yep. So you hear this kind of going back and forth. And this excerpt that I played to me was really striking because you get these really super high violin microtones, right? That almost hurts your ear. And I wonder, is that how she would hear some of this music? She's actually hearing a lot of these higher frequencies?
Yes and no. She doesn't have tinnitus, but my dad does. And so that was another layer to it, because in my dad tinnitus came later. It was in until maybe 5 years ago that we realized that he had it. I mean, just hearing loss has been like a very present thing in my family in the last couple of years. So that's why I added the high violin part, which is just artificial harmonics, very high, and also that in conversation with the shaker, almost like these just like super high frequency.
Or even noise, or shaker like noise.
Yeah,
itself
exactly.
As well,
Yeah.
like white noise kind of feeling to it too. There's a lot of these kind of white noise breath sounds or various percussion sounds you use that kind of replicate a noise and the high frequency like the quartales later on.
Yeah, totally.
So,
yeah. And the whole idea was that, it's interesting to kind of like have these two things together because, tinnitus like usually have like that super high frequency pitch complete present in your life. But then hearing loss that my mom has, you start by losing the higher frequencies, of course, and most hearing loss. And the idea was in the piece to basically have a reverse process of hearing loss where you first start with the most muted version of it and then slowly you start regaining those frequencies back. And so in the beginning, all the winds, all the strings, they are playing either half air sounds or completely muted, and then of course, like as you mentioned, the shaker and the artificial harmonics are giving like these high frequencies, so there's no in between. It's very heavy in the low frequency range, and you get like that very muted sound and powerful sound in the lower register, but there's nothing in the mid-high range, or what there is, it's not necessarily something that you can easily discern. It's more focused on that noisy aspect of things, not as focused. And then as the piece progresses, you start adding that, and then you have finally the winds actually play notes.
I mean, it reminded me of like watching, like, when you're like in your Logic or your Pro Tools software and you're kind of playing around with the EQ settings.
Yeah.
That's literally what I was thinking of as I was listening to the piece. I was like, wow, I only hear like really low frequencies and really high frequencies and nothing, which is kind of a strange experience.
Totally.
When you're listening
it's kind of disorienting.
Especially this is basically an orchestral piece, with 15 or so players. I mean, you expect to get the full frequency of sound. Like any piece you hear with that number of players, you usually get the whole range of sounds, frequencies, almost throughout the entire piece. So to me, it was strange to kind of hear this EQing changing in and out. That's why I thought maybe it didn't need to have that backstory. You could, if you're hearing it more from that electronic music point of view, it also makes sense in that way. So when you're working with Alarm Will Sound, I mean, what is it like working with them in general? Because I've actually heard so many pieces by them. What's the process like of actually getting this thing? Because you have so many notational things happening. Do you even have to explain them to a band like this? Like, what's the difference between working with them and maybe working with, I don't know, the Chicago Sinfonietta or something, like a group that is way more conservative in their approach to music in general?
Totally. I think it's almost, to me, Alarm Will Sound is the most small chamber music ensemble, but within the context of a large chamber music ensemble that you will ever encounter. Because it truly, even though, it's a pretty big ensemble, the way that you work with them and the way they approach the music making process, it just doesn't feel, even though, it's still like a limited amount of time, it still feels like you're having this personal touch and they're bringing something to the music. So of course, you do your due diligence in terms of explaining notation and stuff, but most of it just completely like worked or snap into place almost immediately. And the things that were like not quite working, they also brought like so many suggestions. When we first did workshops, as I mentioned, the winds at the beginning of the piece have a lot of breathy sounds and these non-pitched sounds. It was my first time working as extensively with that kind of notation and those kind of sounds and extended techniques. So I was just trying out things for the workshop. And yeah, even within that small workshop, all the wind players had so many suggestions, and it was like, great. And again, things that normally happen when you're working with a quartet or stuff like that, in orchestras, you should so rush the whole process because, everything costs so much money that you don't have that. But I literally left that workshop feeling like, I just had a normal workshop with a chamber ensemble. And I think that personal touch of, you actually get to know a little bit all the musicians. I think it was very important for a piece like this.
The workshop that you're talking about, was that the Mizzou workshop, or was that something different?
This happened because of they were going to be doing Donaka's piece. He had Donaka then he
was a faculty at Princeton.
Yeah, and he's
where I didn't mention this yet, but you're a fellow at Princeton right now.
He did this large piece for them, and so they were going to be in campus workshopping that piece because later they were going to premiere it in Germany, I think. And so they did the readings of these pieces. They first did a workshop, and then they came back for the performance. So we had actually a good amount of time. We had the workshops in August, I think. And then we actually had the deadline to finish the piece on January or so. So I had a lot of time. I mean, my initial workshop, even though all the ideas were there, I basically threw out 95% of it.
Jesus Christ.
and it was one of those things that it was like, the idea, the concept is there, but the sound of it, it's just not clicking.
You threw it out after you heard the first workshop, or you threw it out before you got there?
No, after I heard it, because that year was very hectic in terms of I had lots of projects going on. So I was going kind of like bouncing from thing to thing, and it was just after the workshop, I had like 3 other deadlines. So this was in the back of my mind, but I wasn't actively working on it.
Yeah. So
after that, I remember that after I finished most of my deadlines, I still had only like a month and a half to finish the piece. And it's awesome to get to work with them. They're incredible ensembles. So you want to do a good job, and I had lots of pressure in terms of delivering something that I felt good with, that I felt like happy with it, and that I could connect with. And I just like kept listening back to the workshop, just like, this is not it. And again, like the concept was there. And I think that's something that I'm a person that writes like beginnings first. And if I don't click, like I don't love the beginning, it's very hard for me to continue.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and I need to have something that I feel very, very passionate about. And I just didn't have that with the workshop. The things were kind of there, but they were, I don't know.
But you're passionate about the concept.
Yeah, exactly.
The concept never changed.
I knew that was not going to change.
I'm the same way. If I'm in love with the concept, I don't care how it goes, really. I need to make sure that the music follows the concept. Like, I'm not going to throw away the concept, is what I mean. I'm not going to be halfway through and say, okay, the concept sucked. Like, no, it was because I sucked at executing it. I'm not going to blame the concept. I'm going to blame myself, which is kind of dangerous in a way. But
no, but I think there's a distinction. Sometimes you can have a solid concept that's just not quite working out yet. Musically, and I think those are two very different things. I think a music should be able, hopefully, to stand on its own 2 legs, musically speaking, right. And the concept should just enhance that. And that's what I felt with the initial material that I had. It was like concept, it's like I'm 100% happy with the direction that I'm going to take this piece. This is what I want to do. But there was, from the beginning, there was like the pianist is using a MIDI controller that is just triggering samples. That was always there. But the samples themselves, and basically the idea, the unique thing about the piece, it was the orchestrational idea first, and also the idea of the sampling. And I think one of the things that changed the most when I started actually working on the piece was to put that at the forefront. That's something that I've been kind of relentless lately. This idea of what's at the core of this piece and just trimming all the fat, You just want to hyper-focus as much as possible. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. But you want to have all the arrows pointed towards that direction. And that was the hardest thing, to figure that out. And I remember I gave myself 5 days because, I already had a very limited amount of time. And it was like, if in 5 days I cannot come up with something that
5 days.
Yeah, if I cannot
very
come
hard
up
on yourself.
If I cannot come up with
5 days
with at least like 15 or 30 seconds of music, then I'm like, this is it. And then
it's an ultimatum.
Yeah, basically. Yeah, and I was like, then I will continue with the material from the workshop, I guess. It was the last day, and I remember that I wrote literally the first 16 to 20 measures, and I wasn't entirely convinced. And I had, we were talking about before sitting down here about coffee at 8 p.m. I was having coffee at 8 p.m. And then I came back. I I don't have a good mindset. I don't know if this happens to you. When I'm listening to a playback or something, or if I'm playing on the piano, I'm a terrible pianist, but I try my best. I don't have a clear mindset if I'm playing it or if I'm in a space of work. I usually export things or record myself and then do other stuff while listening to it. And then that's when I know if I like something or not. I remember feeling kind of like, oh, there's something here. But then I exported it and then I listened to it and it's like, oh yeah, this is it. And that was that moment of
exporting. When you say exporting it, you mean the just the sampling sounds, or like the sampler plus whatever MIDI instruments you're using?
It was just a sampler. I came up with the ba-dum, which is the initial gesture in the piece. And I was like, that's pretty neat. But then another friction that I've been working more and more extensively with electronics, is that, it's always hard, and people often talk about that mixing electroacoustic music, but it's one of those things that even though people talk a lot about it, and that's one of the biggest discussions, still very hard to get. And at that point, I already started working like the instrumental part, but still, I had a setup where I could hear like both the sampler and the MIDI mock-up at the same time. So I was hearing both, but things were not necessarily clicking yet. And it wasn't until I had that cup of coffee that I kind of like started digging a little bit more into the orchestration side of things. And then suddenly I had the moment of, yeah, this is what the instrumental writing is. Because it's almost like I have like two aha moments usually when I'm working in electroacoustic music. It's first how the electronics are going to sound, or vice versa. Sometimes it starts the other way around. And then how are the instruments are going to relate to this. And it's almost like two separate conceptual ideas of what's their language, And it's very hard to get those right. And I think for this piece, I feel pretty good with the results.
Well, I thought it was terrific, but you have this other piece too, which uses electroacoustic, elements. But this piece in particular, you didn't have to worry about any of the live acoustical instruments. You can just focus on the sound itself that you're producing in the box, and then having players realize that. So I want to play a couple minutes from Artifacts, which is a piece for laptop, keyboard, live electronics, and visuals. Before we were talking about concept, we were talking about your mom and the hearing loss, of course. Here, the concept is completely different. It doesn't seem as personal, but maybe I'm wrong, because this is the part of the piece where this person is typing away and he's making a mistake, and then kind of fixes himself. And then there's like quotation also of Liszt doing these runs there in the very beginning, and then Liszt kind of comes back, or the ghost of Liszt comes back at the very end. You can kind of tell it was by the same guy, because you have the pulse element. You have a lot of the samples sounded actually quite similar between the two pieces. But the concept was couldn't be more opposite, unless I'm getting something wrong here.
No, this piece, a lot of the things that I've been doing start shifting. I came across a composer, Remy Sue, fantastic composer, currently based in Canada. And I remember coming across a piece of his new notations. And like 5, 7 years ago, I remember being fascinated by this piece. Later, I performed the piece and came in contact with Remy, and it's a piece that's very heavy on the electronics. It was a finalist for the Gaudamus Award, and it's just up to 4 performers with game controllers interacting in this virtual environment where everything you do turns into sound. And I remember when we were setting up the piece, because it's a pretty tech-heavy piece, he mentioned this idea of like the title and notations, this idea of the visual environment is the score, it's this almost like feedback loop where everything you're seeing, everything you're interacting with is a score. And that just somehow got stuck in my head, this idea that, the score, in this case, Artifacts, has a score, but it's almost working with the visual element, because what happens when the performance, you need to type these things where it gets glitchy and it's hard to see, and there's the pressure of everything, and there is this element that it's almost like building an interactive system that informs the music. And so that was like the initial idea for the piece.
So the idea is, just to be clear, the idea is writing a physical score, right? That interacts in some way with what we see visually on the projector, and that they have to kind of talk to each other. Is that am I getting that right?
Yeah.
No, it's interesting.
Yeah, it's almost like the score, it's there, but more than anything, the score is there for the piece has 2 type of musical material. One that it's like more straightforward writing, and then the typing tests. And for the typing test, the score, it's almost trivial in a way. It's almost as a thing for the performance, as a guide to know what's happening. But more than anything, all the magic of the piece happens in the visuals, and how that affects there's a lot that if you just see the score, you're completely missing about the piece. And when I first started working in this piece, I also had a similar element of, I often have these moments of, I have this idea, then I started working on it, and then I have another idea, and then I was like, oh, am I gonna change it? And usually once I start working on the piece, like actually writing something that I like, I don't change the concept anymore. But initially this piece, I was like, okay, this was also during the same hectic year. I was like, I don't have a ton of time to work on this piece, so I'm gonna do something simple. It was gonna be just a sampling piece with very rhythmic and stuff. And then I started thinking about that whole idea again of the interactive system, and the Remy's you thought of, building like interactive systems, and how that affects music, and the idea of a score in a digital way. And I was like, oh, what if I have like this like pass or fail thing, which is something that I realized Remy also does in another piece of his. At the time, I didn't realize it, but maybe it was subconsciously in my mind. And again, I gave myself another ultimatum. It's like, I'm just gonna prototype this. I did the visuals and a lot of how the piece is working. It's a software called Touch Designer.
What's the software called?
Touch Designer.
Touch Designer.
Yeah.
How do you spell signer?
Designer.
Oh, designer. Touch Designer.
Yeah.
Okay. And I never heard of it.
Yeah, no, it's a really neat software. It's basically it's mostly used to do real-time visuals.
I'll put that down in the description below too.
Yeah,
in case people want to check.
Yeah,
that out.
it's great, and it also has a great free trial. You can use most of the stuff just with some limitations. So it's similar. Imagine kind of like Max MSP, but for visuals. But you can do way more than that. And
so instead of using like jitter on
Max
exactly,
MSP. It's similar to jitter, but that's the whole thing. So it's more in depth in terms of the visual aspect.
Really? Okay.
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's great, and it has a lot of tools to connect with Ableton. So in the piece, the way everything is working, it's both of those software in tandem. It basically Touch Designer, it's sending information to Ableton, and everything that the performer is doing in the MIDI controller, it's being sent to Ableton and vice versa, and then Ableton sends that information to Touch, and then it's just like this feedback loop of information.
So let me get this straight. So there's 2 keyboards, right?
Yeah.
So you got the piano keyboard that we all know, and of course the computer keyboard that we all know. So these 2 things are things. Where are they being attached to? So are they both going into Ableton?
The MIDI controller, it's going to Ableton.
Yeah.
and then the laptop, it's working, sending information to Touch Designer, and then Touch Designer sending information to Ableton.
Okay, got it. Okay, so the actual computer keyboard, that is not really interacting with Ableton.
Well, at the end,
Directly.
yes, because
Okay.
Touch Designer sends information
Oh,
to.
Lord.
Yeah, so I'm obsessed with that idea of feedback loop.
Right, of course. Going
Yeah,
back
because
and forth between the
for
systems.
example, the MIDI controller, it's going straight into Ableton, but then Ableton is sending information back to Touch. So it's that kind of like cause like domino thing, you know?
I got to ask you something then, because first of all, I love this piece. I like all your music actually, but this piece, it got me laughing too. That was the other thing, which is hard to do in music. Do you ever wonder, because I'm asking this mainly for me, I suppose, because this happened to me a couple of weeks ago where this player wanted to play one of my pieces that had electronics. And by the way, the electronics were way simpler than what you were doing. But we just couldn't like figure out, like the max patch I was using was like almost 8 years old.
Oh yeah, I had a
and with all the updates and so on, I just couldn't get it to work. And I just told him, I'm really sorry, I spent like a day on this and I still haven't figured it out. And I just can't spend like another day or two. I need to move on. But the other things I got going on, I can't back everything up for this one performance. Do you ever have that worry, or do you say that, I'm fine with this piece just getting played once? I got the documentation, like this great documentation for it. Does that cross your mind, or just saying, you know what, I just want to make sure I get this first performance down, and to hell with what happens after. If somebody wants it, great. If not, I'm fine with that too.
Yeah, a little bit of both. And this is something that yesterday I was talking about.
Oh yeah,
with a friend. Yeah, it's very hard. And I think there are two ways of approaching it. When I was making this piece, and I think it's interesting to compare like the alarm will sound piece and this one, because alarm will sound piece, I can send that to anyone because it's working on Ableton, which you can get a free trial version of it and run it. It's almost like a plug and play thing. There's a little bit of the barrier to entry if you're not familiar with DAWs at all, but that's something that most people like can figure out, or have someone that can help them with that.
Yeah, because with the alarm will sound piece, basically you have the sampler programmed. Right? You just like send a file, and all the sounds are already connected. Like you just plug the MIDI controller, the keyboard in. Yeah. And like as soon as whoever is playing it, those are the correct sounds. They don't have to go into Ableton. Maybe they have to move like volume sliders around.
Yeah,
maybe they have to mix it with the hall.
Yeah. But if you have like a sound person, like you're good. It's just plug and play, get the outs.
But the Artifacts is not like that at all.
No, Artifacts is way more complicated. And when you're working with that type of pieces, you have to, there are ways of like making that easier if you want someone to perform the piece while you're not there. But not only that, the other thing is how demanding the piece is in terms of tech, in terms of hardware. I have a pretty decent laptop, and mine could run it pretty well. But, I tried it in some of the performers' laptops, and their laptops just couldn't run it because it's a little bit intensive on the CPU. So there's also that added element. There's some like tech specs things. So I think with those pieces, you have to see, I think like always my default when composing and when working with tech is go to the most basic idea first. If the concept that I have and the vision for the piece just demands to, have a slightly more difficult approach, or something that I know it's gonna kind of make it more difficult for people to get into the music, then okay, I'll go to that level or whatever. But I always try to make it as simple as possible. Most of my pieces started that way, and this one, the vision that I had of the pass and fail is just there's sort of no other way. If there was any simpler way of doing it, I would have done it, and there maybe is. I'm not also like very good at coding. I'm complete beginner. I just been learning as I make these projects. So in this case, they performed it without me, and I basically they had to download, we got it running, but they had to download like remote access software so I could access to their computer.
So there was another element too.
Yeah, so I had to kind of like set it up because it was another person's laptop, and I had to kind of like make sure that everything is installed, the correct version, so you don't have like the max thing, suddenly like things are not working. So there are a lot of moving parts, and I think that's totally cool if the concept that you want requires that. But if it doesn't, I think you just should make it as approachable as possible, you know? And I'm still like even trying to figure that out in a way to kind of like how to package something in a way that it's accessible. And I think, for example, like someone that you had in the show recently, like Christopher Cerrone, is really good at that. A lot of his electronic pieces, you know, the max patches are built in a way where it's very easy to, and it's good at keeping that up to date. And I think like electronics can be very accessible. But again, to a certain degree, I think that there are some things that are some people are going to be more intimidated by, but that's part of it, you know?
Yeah, I mean, like, well, Chris Cerrone, he's really good at like what you were saying, like finding what is like the simplest idea of a piece, and then I'll make the max patch around it rather than like, okay, I like this, I like this, I like this, and then like figuring out what the max patch is later.
Yeah.
And he even told me one of his pieces, Hoyt's Skammerhorn, which is his like famous piano electronics piece. He actually had an engineer tell him, this piece doesn't have to be played with live electronics. The piece is actually supposed to be for piano and live electronics. You need like a microphone in the piano, and it picks up the sound, and it does its granulation thing. But the engineer told him, we can just make this piano in fixed media. We don't even need to put a mic in the piano, which I thought was very interesting. So even somebody else that wasn't Chris found a way to make it simpler. Right? But it was somebody else that took the initiative. I guess since the piece is known and people want to play it with at least friction as possible, they could figure that out.
And I think, like, again, if you put your mind to it, there are ways of packaging a lot of like even artifacts in a more simpler way, of like just like an installer and something. But that's another thing similar to what you're doing. Like, how much time are you going to spend doing that?
Right.
It's complicated.
But I think what people sometimes lose when they're thinking about like composing, right, is that there really is a sense of experimentation here. I mean, we really are earnestly trying to make new sounds, and not even just new sounds, but new experiences. And I think that is one of the things that make what we do, especially what you do specifically, very different than, like, say, someone that goes into, not to knock commercial music or anything like this, but there is a very different function for doing that kind of music versus like what we're doing, which is like literally trying to create new experiences. And then what usually happens is the best of those ideas, they start coming up 10, 15, 20 years later in the commercial music. And there are a lot of examples of that in history. I mean, the one off the top of my head is like Jerry Goldsmith, his score for The Planets. I mean, it's all like, Ligeti, and it's all and like that kind of influence. It's all like Stravinsky and stuff like that. And the general populace doesn't really know that stuff. But then after they hear The Planets, it's like, oh, or Planet of the Apes, excuse me, the Planet of the Apes. All of a sudden, those sounds, they belong in our general human psyche. They're not these foreign sounds that nobody wants to listen to. Yeah,
totally. And I think like something when you're working a little bit in, and I'm not saying like I'm the most cutting edge person, but at least I think you can be cutting edge within your own kind of like an environment. And when I'm working, for example, pieces like Artifacts, which felt a little bit of uncharted ground for me, because again, all the coding and stuff, it's like me trying to figure out. There was a lot of that piece that changed 2-3 weeks before the performance, because we basically had a workshop period with the performers, and it was awesome. I had these ideas, but it wasn't as interactive and stuff, because I was coming again from the point of view of I'm trying to make this as simple as possible. Again, the piece started as this is just going to be samples similar to the alarmable sound, just plug and play. Then I was like, okay, the test, let me add that. And then, but it just wasn't as effective. And then we started coming up with all these ideas of, what happens if I get 3 things wrong? And it was almost like we had rehearsal, and then it was just me all day getting all of these features in. So there was this very tight like feedback loop in terms of how we're implementing things to the piece. And even though that made the piece what it is, and it's like really proud of that piece, it just makes things more complicated, and also adds to the idea of had the barrier to entry a little bit, because not only I'm working and implementing this stuff in such a small amount of time, so maybe you're not approaching it from that perspective of like everyone can do this, so then I'm adding stuff that requires more tech, blah blah blah. So it just, at the end of the day, it's almost like this experiment that it's in a way meant to be shared with those performers. And again, I'm sure that this piece can be performed by other people, but I don't know, it's almost like this memento of how this piece was created. And I think, you always have to allow some chaos in your process. Not everything can be like super premeditated. And I think the material that I came up with on my own it's so much more boring compared to the final product, even if there are like those complications at the end of the day tech-wise, that it's just, I would take that version any day, it's even if it adds those layers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this just reminds me of another piece of yours this is the piece, My Voice is a Broken Chorus. And the reason what you said reminds me of that, it's for amplified soprano and electronics. I actually perceive this piece as something that actually could be played quite easily.
Oh, yeah.
Because you just have one soprano and then you have a computer, basically. And I don't think there's much else going on as far as
it's just
instrumentation.
electronics.
Yeah, awesome. So let's hear a couple minutes of that. I actually played the slow movement, and the slow movement is called waning, crescent. But you knew that. It's for everybody else.
Actually, I forget the movement.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Sometimes I actually do too.
Yeah, for the longest
I just didn't
time,
want to admit it.
Yeah, I have other names, and every time I'm sending that piece or something, I have the separate audio files, like, which movement's which?
That's funny. This piece is very different. The other two pieces are kind of pulse-based, and this is like straight up like C, natural minor. Very beautiful and very visceral, and I mean, there's a lot of adjectives I can use about it. But this piece itself, I don't remember the order that you wrote all these pieces, but they seem like they were kind of written within like a 2-year period or something, right?
I think a year, all of
or
them.
1-year period. Yeah.
Yeah, this piece was the first one in those. Like, well, technically, the Alarm sound was before that, the workshop. So I always had those sounds in my head, the sampling and stuff. And this one was the first one that I finished in that kind of like stretch of time where I started getting more into this sound. And then the Artifact was one of the most recent. I finished that in June, I think. So yeah, this piece definitely a more simple approach in terms of electronics. Again, like, it's not about making the most complicated thing. If it works in the most simple way, it works. But the interesting thing about this, it had a similar approach to the Artifacts piece in the sense that I remember the idea of the piece initially came because I listened to Flo's Florent album, his newest album. In the title track, it has this Hawkening texture with himself. He's playing bass, but he's Hawkening with like samples version of like other bass sounds. And I was so like mesmerized by that texture, and we were talking about it, and he was like, I want to do that live, but it's very challenging to do live, and I'm trying to figure it out. And I just remember kind of like, I want to do that live, with fixed electronics. If you build it around it, not build it necessarily as a studio piece, you can probably do that live. So that was like the original idea. So
what is it exactly? You have you have a bass you like a upright bass, electric bass?
A
What do you
double
mean?
bass, yeah.
Double bass, and then what is I don't really understand because I
Yeah.
haven't heard it, but what's happening around it exactly?
Yeah, it's basically, there are a lot of layers because, again, this is mostly built as an album piece. But the main idea, especially the hocketing, is there is all these, he's playing and he's hocketing against little samples of him also playing the bass, but they're just samples.
Oh, so they are samples of him playing, but they're
Yeah.
kind of they're hocketing. The rhythms are kind of overlapping
Yeah,
over
yeah.
each other. Okay, and it's all fixed media, fixed.
Yeah,
electronics.
exactly. It's
There's
meant
no
to be as
processing. I see.
as
Okay.
something you listen to in an album. So he was trying to figure out, like, oh, can I actually play this? Can I build a version where this is playable? And I'm actually not sure if he did.
Playable in a live setting.
Yeah, exactly.
Because in a studio recording, it's pretty easy, relatively
Yeah, exactly.
speaking, to put
Yeah.
this all together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I built a piece, like, it's a challenging thing to do, to have like that hocking texture against yourself. So I built a piece around that. I remember doing the first couple of sketches, and I sent them to Charlotte Mundy, the singer who printed the piece, and we talked a lot. Again, like, I always try to really get to know the performers, and we started like talking about like music and stuff, and also about how we felt about the initial sketches, and we started talking about like, oh, maybe a different aesthetic for it. And so the piece started changing a lot, and it started actually to getting a little bit harsher in terms of sound, and which it's from where the first and third movement come from. And then I really wanted to have like a slow movement that was just very beautiful. She's a fantastic singer. So that second movement comes as kind of like this contrasting idea in the middle, where there's still like all the like electronics are layered, are just her singing, but this time I'm just making like digital tape loops. It's just this plugin that allows you to loop things in very imperfect ways.
All those samples you're talking about, those are all her singing.
Yep.
So you recorded her separately in the studio or wherever it was, in her apartment, in the bathroom, wherever. And that was kind of the analogous idea with the bass that she heard,
Yeah.
the upright bass.
Yeah, and basically what I asked her to, because I wanted to do the hocketing, but I also wanted to embrace all the timbrical possibilities of the voice. So I gave her a list of syllables and sounds to make, and she sung every that list in like 5 or 6 notes, and then it kind of like in a sampler, I repitched to whatever I needed. So yeah, that's all I had. So in my computer, there's still like a file where it's just like a keyboard, but depending on how, like the velocity, how hard you press the key, there are like different Charlotte's like timbre sounds. So you can like play a piano piece, but it's just
so you
her
adjusted
samples.
the velocity of each of the samples too, and that would
That
play a different
gives you
sample?
the different, yeah, it's the same
Really?
note, but it will give you, for example, like a ka, p sound.
Right.
So I had to basically did like a chart, like from here to here in terms of velocity are the pitch sounds, and then on pitch sounds. So when I was writing the piece, it was very hard because like it's easy to write a hocket. It's difficult to write a hocket that's singable, that you can
Right.
actually sing.
But those are more in the first and last movements, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But
And
here in the second movement, because they only
right.
heard the second movement.
Totally. Yeah, I forgot about that.
In the second movement, it's basically about these layers of
Yep.
these. It's just like literal layers of her
Yep.
voice, and then you have her actual voice singing over it with this like C minor
Yep,
sort of
yep.
thing. But was her voice over all this stuff? Was it not processed? Was it processed, or was
Yes
there
and
anything
no.
going on?
I got that plugin that I mentioned that I cannot remember the name, but it's basically mimicking when you make cassette tape loops.
Okay.
And I came to this idea because I have a friend, Justin Ryder, who is also in the doctorate program at Princeton, and he is obsessed with these cassette loops. And he was showing them to us, and they sound amazing because first of all, once you transfer something to cassette, it has there's a little downgrade in terms of like quality. It gets this lo-fi sound, and also when you loop it, there is not like when you're working a DAW where you can perfectly snap where you want the loop to happen. You kind of like approximate, and sometimes you even get these imperfections when it's looping because the material, the tape you use to put the loop together. So I was like, I'm really into it, but I was like, I'm not gonna learn how to do table loops just for this. So there is this plugin that kind of like imitates that sound. So I asked Charlotte to send me like small snippets of her like singing like different notes, different textures, and I just put a lot of that in that plugin, and it just started recording like tons of layers. It was like there was a session where there's probably over half an hour of just like tiny textures and stuff and then I record two and then would layer those two and stuff and then just kind of like keep coming up with ideas. And so I ended up in that kind of like woozy kind of like sound world that you hear. And it was, I don't know, it was surprisingly like hard to compose because as you mentioned, most of my music is very rhythmic and this is very lyric. And for years, I've always said, oh, I cannot write vocal music. That's something that I cannot do. I cannot write melodies.
I feel the same way. Well,
yeah.
I feel like I can write melodies, but the vocal stuff,
it was.
I always shy away from that too.
Yeah, for me, it was like two things. I just didn't feel like I could approach in a way that felt compelling to me, and in a way that felt idiomatic for the voice. Those were the two main things. So when I started writing this, I was like, I'm actually going to write something that feels like a vocal piece because the first and third movement are, very idiosyncratic in way of approaching vocal music. And this one, I just wanted to write something that almost felt like an aria. So that's where a lot of like that started, like how those ideas started like happening. And then when I started writing it, I was in Puerto Rico at the time, visiting my family, and I was just mostly kind of like, I had textures, but I started playing on guitar, like a lot of and it was interesting because I approached it through the loops. A lot of the harmony came as a result of that. And so I started like thinking about like those chord progressions from those tiny loops. I was not necessarily thinking about like chords or functional harmony or anything like that. I was just putting like things after each other because they sounded cool. And then after that, I had like a good sense of the sound world that I wanted. I started writing down like the harmony and stuff and the chords. And then after that, I completely turned off my computer. I wrote the whole thing in guitar and I was singing on top of it. I'm also a terrible singer, terrible pianist and terrible singer. So it was a really fun experience.
Well, I'm the same way.
Yeah.
And I do both when I compose. So
yeah, exactly.
I'm right with you.
Yeah, so I wrote this movement kind of like me singing while playing guitar because, MIDI voices are terrible. They really give you really throws you off a lot. I think like MIDI has come very far in terms of like music notation software. The vocal
is absolute trash.
Yeah, that's the thing. So like, and if you're like writing something that does not require a lot of that, then that's cool. But when you're writing something that it lives and dies in that lyricism, you can like have such a false sense. And that's like sense of how it sounds. That's why I completely turned it off and wrote the whole thing by hand. And I remember after I finished writing it, I kind of like came back and then kind of started sorting through that nightmare Ableton session of all the like half an hour of like text, just like trying to build the chord progression that I had like written down, but now with these imperfect loops, it was very challenging to get everything right. And so I built the electronics, and I remember I sent her the score, and I was like, hey, like if you have like 15 minutes, can you do like a reading of this just to see if this works? Because I remember saying like, oh, I think this is gonna completely change because I think this is not working. But I was like, I already spent like a lot of time writing this. I'm just gonna try it out. And then she sent me back the recording, and I was like, oh, wait, this sounds good. So it was one of those few moments, I think, where I completely changed my mind. Usually, if I'm not convinced of it when I'm writing it, 99% of the time, the performance does not actually convince me. Even if I'm using like MIDI mock-up or not, I need to be like 100% into like what I'm writing at the moment. But this was one of the few examples where I wasn't sure, and I think like I'm not sure if it's vocal music or what, but there was something about it that clicked so much once I heard it.
As well, it's also the way she sings. I mean, she has a particular way of singing as well, and I feel like vocalists, especially the more they kind of delve out of the bel canto kind of style, you get to hear their personality a little bit more. And maybe that's what I noticed, like if you look at the score by itself, I mean, she's doing few more things than what the score is saying, and that maybe added to what you liked about what you heard. I mean, at least I liked it. You know?
No, yeah. And there were like even like some things that she changed. Like there was supposed to be this all like from muted to like open vowel singing, and she actually did like ahs, I think, to get that change of timbre, but also like make it speak a little bit more. So there were all of these tiny stuff that I think like she made like so many fantastic changes. And yeah, but at the same time, like I wrote, there's a piece by also incredible composer James Diaz that he wrote for Tack Ensemble where Charlotte sings. And I remember like listening to this piece like years ago, and I completely fell in love with the vocal part. And I remember kind of like, and there's even like kind of like not a quote because it's just a major second, but there's like an inflection, like a major second gliss that came from that James Diaz piece. So yeah, this piece like a little bit was, that movement in particular was me challenging to get that vocal writing and then to make it sound like this is a voice. And all the runs at the end are kind of me just writing something that if you look at all my scores, you're never ever gonna find him writing like that. And it was challenging, but yeah, it was a little bit of a kind of like I guess like a test for myself. Like, oh, can I write something that's lyrical and
well,
works?
that's why I wanted to include this one.
Yeah,
because
yeah,
it was surprising to me, and I think this was maybe the last thing I heard too. I said, "Oh, whoa, this is like something very different that I didn't expect you to write." Yeah, and it also kind of shows this idea of people kind of. And I see this happening a lot nowadays. I think just because there's so many of us out there, actually, a lot of like people kind of pigeonhole, like, okay, this person does this person does that. But I mean, this kind of thing that we're doing here with your music, there's a lot of things that you could do: the vocal writing, the sampler, the writing for like an orchestra, basically. There's all these things that we as composers are kind of expected to be able to do these days. Yeah. And it's amazing how many of us are kind of out there doing it. It's like, it's really inspiring, at least for me.
Yeah, no. And sometimes it's hard because then, people like always try to box your career into one idea. Like this is the orchestra composer or whatever.
Right.
And as you say, like all of like, especially I think right now, all of us like have worked to a certain degree into all of these fields. We've done a little bit of electronic orchestra, and sometimes you find your thing that you want to specialize more on. But I think for now, similar to what we're talking about electronics, for example, I think I'm almost embracing it as a kind of like an ongoing experimentation, even though the things that excite me the most right now are more in the electroacoustic world. But there's so much. I've actually been writing a lot of like orchestra music lately, and it's always refreshing. And at the same time, one classic thing, I don't know if this happens to you, when I'm working orchestra piece, I'm like, I wish this was a chamber piece. And when I'm working electronics, I'm like, oh, it would be so easy if I was writing just a acoustic piece. And there's a lot of that back and forth in terms of your own thoughts, but I think it's very important to keep that present and to exercise all of those muscles a little bit and kind of like seeing how everything influence each other.
That's kind of funny. I sometimes I do have that thinking, but it's usually like I'm like 2/3 of the way done with a piece, and then I'm like thinking about the next piece. That's usually what happens. Yeah. It's not like I wish this piece was something else. It was like, oh man, really? I see the finish line on this one. What let me think about the next one. But I'm like, wait, no, stop doing that. You got to focus on this one. You got to give your effort to this one, and then you can do the next one. It's not a race. Yeah. And I think that's also kind of an ongoing issue too in our field. It's like people feel like they're in a race to like, I got to do the next thing because I got to win this contest, then I got to do this grant and this. It's like, no, just kind of focus. It's actually, since I've slowed down a little bit with I still write a lot, but compared to like when I was in school, I was like, it was a rat race, especially at Juilliard. It was like, as soon as one piece is done, the next day I'm writing a brand new piece and for a completely different ensemble. But nowadays I'm like, I finish a piece and sometimes I don't write for like another month or even 2 months sometimes. And I'm like totally cool with it. And I trust that I can get back into that mindset of writing that next piece. Like it used to be like, oh my God, if I don't write for a week, I'm going to forget how to write. But I don't know if you deal with these issues, but it sounds like you're more the type that you're writing a lot of pieces at once. So you maybe you don't have those periods where you're not writing.
I'm currently going through a transformation process. I've always, ever since I was a kid, I've always been like really attracted to this idea of like always like be working on like in something, and I always be like tinkering with something. So a lot of that started naturally sipping into like the way I compose. So I have definitely those moments of like where every single day, and as soon as I finish a piece, like literally yesterday I didn't finish a piece, but I finished some sketches for a workshop, and literally after I finished, I was like, oh, I want to write like the next thing. I started writing the next thing, and it's like almost like an anxiety thing. This year I actually started reframing that mindset. As I mentioned, last year was very hectic, and even though I did like lots of projects that I'm extremely happy with, but I think right now the way I feel like I want to slow down a little bit and work, dedicating more time to each project. And the orchestra piece that I finished on August was the first piece that I dedicated like such a long amount of time. I mean, I usually compose fairly fast. First of all, I was kind of like afraid of spending like kind of like dedicating so much time to this one project. I feel like weird slowing down so much. And I've actually been enjoying it more and more, but it's hard to, I don't know how was your like transition in terms of that, but I've actually been enjoying it, but you still have that like remnant, like anxiety from the rat race kind of like mindset. And I'm trying to stay away from that and trying to focus each piece more as as a statement, whether it succeeds or not, because I don't think every piece is gonna be like incredible, but at least that's the way I want to approach it. Kind of like I'm gonna do my very best, and if it works out, sometimes things do not click, and that's okay. For example, like the Alarm Was On piece was building on top of ideas that I previously had, and they were not quite clicking, and then this piece was when it clicked, and in the other ones I worked as hard, but it just like sometimes it just doesn't work.
I mean, it goes to show there's not like really one way to do it.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
And then also this whole idea that you're reframing how you're thinking. You're like you're self-aware as well, which I think is really important as a composer too, to be kind of aware of like, okay, what are your weaknesses? What are your strengths?
Yeah,
and to also like kind of make use of them too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I do like compose like pretty much every day, but I've been slowly realizing that maybe that's not coming from like the most like maybe like healthiest like kind of like mindset in that sense. And also like embracing everything that I'm interested in. Also even like outside of music, I think that's another thing, kind of like how composition can become your whole thing.
Right.
And your whole identity. Yeah, and I think like that, again, that rat race mentality kind of like contributes to that. You need to do this, and it's just like this thing that it just keeps going, this like treadmill of like things you have to do. And then it really, at least for me, it got me into like a very particular mindset, and I was like, I did projects I feel like super happy with, but this year I'm trying to approach it from a different perspective, and I still have a little bit of that kind of like FOMO, I guess, if like it just feels weird to, even though I'm still like writing a lot of music, but it's slower than before, and it just takes some time to adjust. So I don't know.
Stay on the treadmill. Maybe don't put it on 8.0. Put it on like 4.0, 3.0.
Yeah, exactly.
And I'm looking forward to hearing more of your stuff. Totally. Just maybe slower on the treadmill there. Yeah. So thanks for coming on. I appreciate that.
Of course. No, thank you so much for having me. This is really fun.